If I told you that walking could actually accelerate aging after 70, would you believe me? For years, Thomas believed that the key to staying healthy was simple: just keep moving. Every morning, he would lace up his sneakers, step outside his small wooden cabin, and follow the same quiet path winding through the trees. It was a ritual he never missed. With each step, he felt connected to something greater: the rhythm of life, the wisdom of time. To him, walking wasn't just exercise. It was a form of meditation, a way to keep his body in motion and his mind at peace. He had read about Buddhist monks who walked for miles in silent contemplation, finding enlightenment in each deliberate step. And so Thomas walked, not just to stay fit, but to honor the belief that movement meant life. But one crisp autumn morning, everything changed. As he stepped down from his porch, something unexpected happened. His foot wavered. For the first time in his life, he felt unsteady. His knee buckled slightly, and his hand instinctively grabbed for the wooden railing. His heart pounded as he caught himself just in time. He stood there for a moment, shaken. Why had that happened? It was just a small misstep, barely noticeable. But as he looked down at his legs, a wave of unease crept over him. Had his body begun to betray him? For decades, Thomas had trusted that his daily walks would keep him strong. But in that fleeting moment of instability, a question lingered in his mind. Is walking really enough? He didn't want to admit it, not yet. But something inside him whispered the truth. He wasn't as strong as he once was. The same legs that had carried him for thousands of miles now felt different, slower, less certain. Later that evening, as he sat by the fire, his mind kept returning to that moment. It wasn't the stumble itself that unsettled him. It was the fear it left behind. If he could lose his balance so easily today, what would happen tomorrow? He had always thought of aging as something that happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the slow changing of the seasons. But now, he felt it all at once, like a gust of wind knocking the leaves from the trees. What if there was more to staying strong than just walking? That night, Thomas made a decision. He wouldn't ignore what had happened. He wouldn't pretend that walking alone could protect him from the passing of time. Instead, he would seek answers, real answers, about how to keep not just moving, but thriving. And so his journey began. Are you sure walking is enough? If you've ever believed, like Thomas, that walking is all you need to stay healthy, you might want to think again. What he discovered next could change the way you look at aging and your own future. Keep reading, because this might be the most important lesson you'll ever learn about growing older. One misstep that changed everything, from a trusted habit to a warning sign. For more than 20 years, Thomas had walked the same path, believing it was the secret to staying strong. Every morning, before the town had fully woken up, he would step outside, take a deep breath of the crisp morning air, and set off down the familiar trail. The rhythm of his steps was as steady as his heartbeat, carrying him through quiet streets and winding forest paths. Walking was his anchor, his way of staying connected, to nature, to himself, and to the years he had left. He had never doubted it until now. That small misstep off the porch, that fleeting moment of weakness, had shaken something deep inside him. He had always trusted his body, relied on it without question. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if it could still carry him the way it once had. That evening, as he sat in his favorite chair by the window, he stared down at his legs, at the same feet that had taken him everywhere in life. You failing me, he thought, flexing his toes inside his worn-in walking shoes. It wasn't an easy thought to accept. He wasn't the kind of man to dwell on fear, but something about that single moment of unsteadiness lingered in his mind. He had always assumed aging would happen slowly, like the gradual fading of a photograph. But this felt sudden. This felt like a warning. A conversation that changed everything. The next day, Thomas found himself sitting across from his oldest friend Daniel at their favorite diner. Daniel, a retired doctor with decades of experience, had always been the one Thomas turned to when something didn't feel quite right. He trusted him, not just because of his medical knowledge, but because Daniel had a way of making complicated things seem simple. Thomas wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, staring down at the swirling steam. "I had a moment yesterday," he finally said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "A moment? A misstep," Thomas admitted. "Stepped off the porch, and for a second I wasn't steady. It caught me off guard." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying his friend. Then, after a moment, he smiled. "Let me ask you." "Something?" he said. "Have you ever seen an old oak tree?" Thomas blinked at the unexpected question. "Of course." "What keeps it standing?" Daniel asked. Thomas frowned. "Its roots, I suppose." Daniel nodded. "True. But roots alone don't keep a tree strong. It also needs a solid trunk, flexible branches, and the ability to bend with the wind without breaking. Without all those things, even the strongest roots won't stop it from falling in a storm." Thomas tilted his head, trying to see where this was going. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You, my friend, are that tree. Walking has been your roots. It's kept you grounded, moving, alive. But if all you do is walk, and you don't strengthen your trunk, your branches, and your balance, well, sooner or later you're going to feel the storm." Thomas stared at him. The words hit something deep inside him, something he had been trying to ignore. Daniel continued. "As we age, our muscles shrink, our balance weakens, our joints stiffen. If you don't actively work to counter that decline, walking alone won't save you. In fact, it might even give you a false sense of security." Thomas exhaled, running a hand over his face. "So what are you saying?" he asked finally. "That walking isn't enough?" Daniel nodded. "It's a great start, Thomas, but if you want to keep moving without fear, if you want to keep doing the things you love without worrying about the next misstep, then you need more." Thomas sat back, the weight of those words settling in his chest. He had always believed that as long as he kept walking, he would be fine. But now, he wasn't so sure. The first lesson: walking is good, but it's not enough. That night, as he walked home from the diner, Thomas noticed things he hadn't before. The uneven pavement beneath his feet, the slight ache in his knees, the way his posture slumped just a little more than it used to. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe it was time to look beyond just walking. Maybe, if he wanted to truly stay strong, he needed to start training like a tree, building his strength, his balance, and his resilience. Because life wasn't just about moving forward. It was about staying steady, no matter what came next. The 5 pillars of strength in aging strength training, so every step remains steady. That evening, after his conversation with Daniel, Thomas sat in his living room staring at his favorite armchair. It should be easy, he thought. Daniel had told him about a simple test, a way to gauge his strength. Stand up from a chair without using your hands. Thomas took a deep breath, pressed his feet firmly against the floor, and pushed himself up. For a moment, his body hesitated. His legs trembled slightly, and he instinctively reached for the armrest, but then he stopped himself. He wobbled, his knees protesting, and finally managed to stand, though not as smoothly as he had expected. A quiet realization settled in his chest. His legs were weaker than he thought. Walking had kept them moving, but it hadn't kept them strong. He sat back down, exhaling slowly. When had this happened? When had his body, once so reliable, so steady, started to betray him? The next morning he called Daniel. "You were right," Thomas admitted. "I tried standing up without my hands, and let's just say, it wasn't pretty." Daniel chuckled on the other end of the line. "That's your body telling you something, my friend. It's not too late to fix it, but you have to start now." "How?" Thomas asked. "Small steps," Daniel said. "Start by strengthening your legs. Bodyweight squats, lifting light objects, using resistance bands. You don't need a gym. You just need to challenge your muscles a little more each day." That afternoon, Thomas picked up a water bottle from the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Holding it in both hands, he slowly lifted it over his head and back down. Then he bent his knees slightly, just a small squat, feeling the way his legs resisted the movement. It was harder than he expected. He laughed under his breath. "So this is where I begin." The lesson of the monks later that night, as he sat on his porch, Thomas thought about something Daniel had said earlier. Ever heard of the monks who stand for hours in meditation? Thomas had. He had read about Buddhist monks, some well into their 80s, who could sit perfectly still for hours, their posture unwavering, their legs strong beneath them. They weren't just spiritually disciplined, they were physically resilient. They had trained their bodies as they had trained their minds, knowing that true strength came from balance, endurance, and daily practice. Thomas leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was time to start training like the monks, because aging wasn't about slowing down. It was about staying strong enough to keep going, finding balance, preventing the fall that changes everything. The next morning, Thomas stood in front of his bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, staring at his reflection. Daniel's words echoed in his mind. Stand on one leg while brushing your teeth. It sounded simple enough. Thomas took a deep breath, shifted his weight, and slowly lifted one foot off the ground. At first he felt steady, but within seconds his body wobbled, his free foot hovering uncertainly in the air. His arms flinched, reaching for the counter out of instinct. He put his foot down. A strange mix of frustration and surprise filled his chest. Had his balance really gotten this bad? He tried again. This time he focused not just on his body but on his breathing, his center, his control. A few seconds passed. 5, 7. Then the wobble returned. He sighed, planting both feet back on the tile floor. That's when he truly understood what Daniel had meant. Balance isn't just physical. It's mental. Later that afternoon, as they sat on Daniel's back porch drinking tea, Thomas recounted the challenge. I thought I had good balance, he admitted. I've been walking every day for years, but standing on one leg? That was harder than I expected. Daniel nodded knowingly. That's the thing, Thomas. Walking keeps you moving, but it doesn't really train your balance. And after 70, balance isn't just important. It's critical. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Daniel set his teacup down and leaned forward. You know how monks practice walking. Meditation. How they move slowly, deliberately, fully aware of every step. Thomas nodded. He had always admired the discipline of Buddhist monks, their ability to stay present in every movement. That's balance, Daniel said. It's not just physical, it's mental. It's about focus, control, and awareness. When you were standing on one leg this morning, your body wasn't the only thing struggling. Your mind was trying to catch up too. Thomas exhaled. That made sense, Daniel continued. Here's the truth. One bad fall can change everything. A misstep, a moment of lost control, and suddenly you're not just dealing with a stumble, you're dealing with a broken hip, months of recovery, maybe even losing your independence. Thomas thought back to his misstep off the porch. How easy it had been to almost fall. A single moment could have altered the rest of his life. Daniel smiled gently. The good news? You can train for this. Balance isn't just something you lose, it's something you can rebuild. The lesson. Walking the tightrope of life that evening, Thomas stood again in front of the mirror. He lifted one foot. This time he breathed deeply, focused, adjusted. He still wobbled, but not as much. And as he stood there, he realized something. Balance wasn't just about staying upright. It was about learning to steady yourself no matter what came next. Thomas had always prided himself on being independent. He never hesitated to bend down to tie his shoes, turn to grab something from the back seat of his car, or reach for a book on the highest shelf. These were things he had done effortlessly. For decades, movements so simple he never thought twice about them. But one evening, as he sat in his armchair and twisted to grab a cushion behind him, something unexpected happened. His shoulder resisted. His spine felt stiff. The motion that should have been smooth and easy felt restricted, as if his body had been quietly locking up without his permission. He froze, surprised by the unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't pain, at least not yet, but it was something close. A tightness, a limitation where there hadn't been one before. He slowly sat forward, pressing his hands against his thighs as he tried to shake off the discomfort. Had he always felt this way? Or had his body been tightening, stiffening, little by little, so slowly that he had failed to notice until now? The thought unsettled him. He had assumed that as long as he kept moving, he would stay mobile. But now, for the first time, he wondered if movement alone had been enough. The next day, as he and Daniel sat outside on the porch, Thomas shared his realization. I feel like I'm turning into a board, he admitted, rolling his shoulders. as if trying to loosen them. I used to move so easily, and now it's like my body is fighting against me. Daniel smiled knowingly. That's because, just like in life, the less we stretch ourselves, the more rigid we become. People think that staying active means staying flexible, but the truth is flexibility isn't automatic. It has to be trained. Thomas frowned. So what do I do? Just stretch every now and then. Daniel shook his head. No, not every now and then. Every day. Think of it like oiling a machine. If you let it sit too long without care, the gears start to grind, the joints stiffen, and suddenly it doesn't move as well as it used to. He leaned back in his chair and gestured toward the trees swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. A tree that bends survives the storm. A tree that refuses to move is the first to snap. That evening Thomas decided to start small. He stood in the center of his living room, rolling his shoulders, tilting his head from side to side, reaching his arms overhead. At first, the movements felt foreign, almost forced, as if his body were resisting. But as he continued, inch by inch, breath by breath, something shifted. The stiffness didn't disappear overnight, but each day he felt a little looser, a little lighter, a little more free. He realized that flexibility wasn't just about his body, it was about his mindset. The more he allowed himself to adapt, the easier everything became. The key to aging well wasn't just staying strong, it was staying open, staying fluid, staying willing to move in new ways. Stand tall, walk like a mountain. Thomas had never thought much about his posture. He walked every day, stayed active, and assumed his body carried him just as it always had. But on a quiet afternoon, standing in front of his hallway mirror, something caught his eye. He tilted his head, studying his reflection. His shoulders slumped forward slightly, his lower back curved inward, and his neck seemed to lean just a little too far ahead. It was subtle but undeniable. Curious, he stepped back to the nearest wall and pressed his back against it. He expected his body to fall into alignment naturally, but the moment he tried, he realized something unsettling. His head and lower back did not touch the surface. He had to force them into place. A wave of discomfort ran through him as he struggled to maintain the position. He hadn't noticed it before, but standing truly upright felt unnatural. Later that evening he mentioned it to Daniel as they sat outside watching the sun fade into the horizon. Thomas leaned back in his chair, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off the thought. I never noticed it before, but my posture is worse than I thought. When did that happen? Daniel smiled knowingly. It happens so gradually we don't see it. A little slouching here, a little rounding there. Before you know it, your body adapts and what's unnatural starts to feel normal. He took a sip of his tea before continuing. Most people think posture is just about standing up straight, but really it's about how you carry yourself through the world. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Daniel gestured toward the large painting that hung in his study, a vast mountain standing tall against the elements, its peak lost in the clouds. A mountain never leans, he said. No matter the wind, no matter the years, it stands strong, unshaken. That's what we need to do. Stand tall, not just in body, but in presence. The words settled deep within Thomas. He had spent his whole life moving forward, but now, for the first time, he thought about how he moved. Had he been walking through life carrying an invisible weight? Had years of looking down, of focusing only on the next step, slowly reshaped his body into something he no longer recognized? Daniel showed him a few simple exercises to help realign his posture, pressing his back against the wall and adjusting until his shoulders, head and hips naturally aligned, sitting without slouching, engaging his core for support. Small movements to strengthen the muscles that held everything in place. The exercises weren't difficult, but they felt different, as if his body was waking up from a long sleep, remembering something it had forgotten. Over the next few weeks, he became more aware of how he sat, how he stood, how he walked. And something changed. His back ached less, his movements felt more natural. And one day, as he stepped outside and took a deep breath of the cool morning air, he noticed something he hadn't in years. He felt taller, not just in body, but in spirit, because he wasn't just correcting his posture. He was reclaiming his strength, and as Daniel had said, a mountain never leans. Protecting the joints. Because every step matters, Thomas had always loved walking. It was his morning ritual, his quiet time with the world. But lately something had changed. After longer walks, he felt a dull ache settling in his knees. It wasn't unbearable, but it was there, a persistent stiffness, a subtle reminder that his body was not the same as it once was. At first he ignored it. He told himself it was just part of aging, just a little discomfort that would pass. But as the days went on, the ache lingered. He found himself slowing down on inclines, avoiding certain uneven paths he once took with ease. One morning, as he stepped onto the porch after his usual route, he hesitated before climbing the stairs. His knee tensed, just enough to make him pause. He exhaled, pressing his palm against the wooden railing for support. He hated that feeling, the uncertainty, the hesitation before a movement that once felt effortless. That evening, he mentioned it to Daniel. "My knees have been bothering me," Thomas admitted. "I've been walking the same way I always have, but now I feel it afterward, like my joints are wearing down." Daniel nodded as if he had been expecting this. "Thomas," he said gently, "your body is like a finely built machine. But even the best machines need maintenance. You've spent years walking, keeping yourself moving, that's good. But movement alone isn't enough. If you don't take care of the joints that carry you, they'll start to wear out before the rest of you is ready to stop." Thomas frowned. "So what do I do? Stop walking?" Daniel shook his head. "Not stop. Adjust. You need to replace some of your walks with movements that strengthen and protect your joints, rather than wear them down. Low-impact exercises, swimming, cycling, even gentle yoga. These will keep you active without putting stress on your knees and hips." Thomas had never considered that. He had always believed more movement was better, but maybe smarter movement was the key. He thought about the gears of an old clock. If not properly oiled, the parts would grind against each other until they could no longer move at all. A few days later, he took Daniel's advice. Instead of his usual long walk, he went to the community pool. The water felt weightless, his knees unburdened by the usual strain. He moved easily, stretching in ways he hadn't in years. It felt good, as if his body was thanking him for finally listening. The next morning he woke up without the usual stiffness. He smiled to himself. He would always love walking, but now he understood the difference between moving for the sake of motion and moving with intention, because every step mattered, and he wanted to keep walking, not just today but for years to come. Thomas had never imagined that something as simple as stepping off his own porch could change the way he saw himself. But now, months after that moment of uncertainty, everything felt different. The hesitation was gone. The fear of losing his balance, of feeling his body betray him, had faded. What replaced it was something he hadn't expected. Not just strength, but confidence. A deep, quiet assurance that he was in control of his own movement, his own aging, his own life. At first the changes had been small. A little less stiffness. In the morning, a little more steadiness when reaching for something on a high shelf. His knees no longer ached after a walk, and he no longer felt the quiet, creeping fear of losing his independence. He had begun to move differently, not just out of habit, but with purpose. He had learned that strength was something to be built, not just something to be preserved. That balance was not guaranteed, but something that had to be trained. That flexibility was not a luxury, but a necessity. That posture was not just about standing tall, but about carrying himself with confidence. And most of all, that movement alone was not enough. He needed to move wisely, intentionally, in a way that would keep him strong for years to come. One crisp morning, Thomas stood before his front door and looked down at the boulder-like step that had once made him pause. He took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, and then, without thinking, he stepped forward. No hesitation, no wobble. His foot landed firmly, his body steady, his mind clear. In that moment, he realized something that had taken him a lifetime to understand. Aging was not a slow unraveling. It was not a surrender. It was an adaptation, a transformation, a chance to grow in ways that youth had never required of him. He had thought he was losing strength, but the truth was, He had been given an opportunity to rebuild it. For years, he had believed that walking was enough. That movement alone would keep him strong. But now, he knew better. He had taken control of his body's future, and in doing so he had taken control of his life. Standing on that step, feeling the solid ground beneath him, he smiled. He would keep moving, keep learning, keep adapting, because it wasn't just about how long he lived, it was about how well he lived. And now, he was living with strength, with wisdom, with purpose. Aging is not about decline. It is about choosing how you adapt. Whether you are 50, 70, or 90, you have the power to protect your body, your balance, and your confidence. You have the choice to move not just more, but better. So ask yourself, are you simply walking through life, or are you walking with intention, with strength, with wisdom? If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever had a moment like Thomas, one that made you rethink how you move, how you live? Share your thoughts, your experiences, and if you found this story meaningful, pass it along to someone who might need to hear it, because every step matters, and together we can make them stronger. Thank you for being here. Keep walking, but walk wisely.